meteorologist here, the Raptors Digest, reacting to some Toronto Raptors news. Obviously, the preseason's just around the corner, media day just happened, and there's been a lot of sound bites, a lot of Raptors players telling their expectations for the season, and one that really caught my eye, and you read the title of the video, is Fred VanVleet. Now, ever since Kawhi Leonard left, Fred VanVleet's been a huge talking point for this team because he's 25 years old, he's about to enter the prime of his career, maybe in the next couple seasons. You know, he's really polished his game, and he's coming off such a strong finals performance, and conference finals specifically. He's a guy that's expected to have a huge role for this Toronto Raptors team this season, and he gave an interview talking about his expectations for himself this season, and like Toronto Raptors fans, they're very high. You know, and the one thing that kind of was brought up that it's been a touchy subject, so to speak, for the past few seasons is Fred VanVleet's role as a starter, because he's a guy that hasn't been starting on this team. He hasn't complained, he hasn't been, disgruntled about it, but he has brought up on numerous occasions that he's looking to be a starting point guard in this league. This was brought up last season, we made a podcast on it last year, and he's pretty clear in saying in the interview that he gave, I believe it was October 1st, so a day ago, that he is looking to be a starter in this league. He's not looking to be a bench guy. He's willing to do whatever the coaching staff is asking him to do. If that's a bench player, then so be it. But, quote, he's shooting for the stars and he's looking to do big things in this league. Now, obviously, that's not coming from a guy that's going to be, that quote wouldn't be said by someone that's angry at the coaching staff or disgruntled with this current situation. But he is certainly inferring that he wants a big, significant role as a starter with this Toronto Raptors team. And that's been supplied to him. He has a phenomenal role. Even 2 years ago when we had DeMar at the 2, Fred would close games being that 2-guard position. Usually DeMar would get shifted to the 3, and then last season it was most notably Danny Green would usually be sat on the bench and Fred VanVleet would close games. And that's usually the most important thing. So I think that's a true sign that the Toronto Raptors believe in him, and I think that's going to go a long way in keeping Fred happy. But, There is expectations for a guy that has had such a especially great end to a postseason. He wants to be a starter in this league, and the one thing that might be a bit worrisome for Toronto Raptors fans is this is a contract year for Fred, and worrisome in the fact that you're worried it's going to be disgruntled, because obviously he's going to be trying to ball out, do as good as he can this year to get the bag, get a big contract after this season. And I think when he signed that 2-year deal, the idea was that Masai Ujiri knew that Kyle Lowry, our 5-time All-Star, he's been All-Star for the past 5 seasons, he's going to be 35 in midway through next season. That's around the age that point guards start to, their progress starts to decline, and we've seen Kyle have injuries in the past, and that would be a perfect time if Fred VanVleet can perform, where he can step in and take the mantle as the starting point guard for the Toronto Raptors. And that would kind of fit the timeline, as Fred VanVleet would be 26, and that's a prime time to be a point guard. That's 26 through 30, 32. That's when a lot of players reach their peak performance. So I think that was the idea of the contracts. But after such a big season, there's been a lot of talk about should Fred VanVleet start this year, and I think the expectations, we just made a video on Kyle Lowry yesterday, so definitely check that video out if you haven't already. But Kyle's going to be a starter. He's a championship point guard this year. I don't think there's any expectations for him to be moved to the bench this season, but there is a possibility that Fred VanVleet could start at the 2 this season. That's where he closed a lot of games, as I just previously mentioned. He might be the starting 2 for this Toronto Raptors team this year, and I think that's something we could definitely take a look at. There's big expectations for Fred, whether he's starting or not, and if, we just lost Danny Green, who's the de facto 2-guard last season, and there's not, Norman Powell, I'm going to get into more about Norman Powell at the end of this podcast, but he's been shown to be inconsistent in past years. We're not really sure what to expect from Matt Thomas this season, despite the fact he looks like a lights-out 3-point shooter. OG's a bit too big to play the 2, and he'll probably be fighting for that 3 position, so there is an opening for Fred VanVleet to play the 2-guard role, and that might be something that Nick Nurse legitimately looks at and says, hey, Fred, we know you want to be a starter. We know you want to leave your impact on the league, and you probably feel you can do that most being a starter. But that's going to be a weird dynamic, and I'll break into why, because that's going to be one of the smallest backcourts in the NBA. Kyle Lowry is about 6'1", 6'2", if that. The real heights of the NBA players are coming out in the next coming days, so we're going to see the real true heights of the smaller guards that usually get boosted a couple inches or so. But Kyle Lowry and Fred VanVleet, despite the fact they're so effective at the end of games, they are a smaller backcourt, and we've seen that be able to work on other teams, specifically the Portland Trailblazers, where CJ McCollum and Damian Lillard, both being kind of undersized. Dame is probably the right size for a point guard, but CJ McCollum is a bit small for a 2. They've been able to dominate the Western Conference. They just made a Western Conference Finals despite having a smaller backcourt. And Fred VanVleet and Kyle have the skills to really be, maybe not necessarily the impact of CJ and Dame, but certainly an effective backcourt in this league. But the one issue I want to bring up is we saw in that Philadelphia 76ers series that, when the Toronto Raptors, when that backcourt of Fred and Kyle goes up against bigger guards, that's when there's a lot of issues to be seen. And we almost lost that series. That's why the Sixers gave us the biggest rut more than the Milwaukee Bucks and even the depleted Golden State Warriors. The Sixers were the closest. They're the only team that brought us to 7 games. That Fred VanVleet and Kyle Lowry really struggled in that series. So, there might be a lot of fans out there thinking that Fred VanVleet and Kyle, even though it's an effective lineup to close games, it might not necessarily be the move to have them out there as the starting unit, the de facto 2 guys to be on the court together just because of their size. So that's an argument I think a lot of people will bring up. But if you're comparing the games of Norman Powell, Fred VanVleet, I think they're going to be the 2 players that are fighting for that 2 guard position. And who knows about Matt Thomas. We're going to see if he can defend at the NBA level and continue to have that killer stroke we've all heard about in Europe. So, for people that don't know, he had a 99% three-point shooting percentage on open threes last year, so that's going to be exciting to see. But I think Fred VanVleet could possibly be the starter at the 2 guard position. I don't think he's going to steal Kyle Lowry's position this season, but in future, that might be where it's at. And, if he doesn't, and there's been reports that, and we might make a whole video on this, Norman Powell has really surprised a lot of the coaching staff of the Toronto Raptors of how well he's been playing in training camp. He's been really tearing things up. So maybe Norman Powell's the one that steps into that 2 guard role because that's his natural position rather than Fred. Maybe, there isn't a spot for Fred VanVleet to get into that starting unit. And I don't think he'll be disgruntled and be a guy that complains, but when we're looking at Fred VanVleet's expectations for the season, when Kawhi Leonard left, Nick Nurse, the first quote he gave out was he told Fred and he told Siakam that there's about 20-30 shots to be had, and a lot of those shots are going to be expected to be given to Fred VanVleet. So will he want to have that more leadership role with this team and take a majority of the shots, be maybe a second or third option in terms of scoring for this roster? And, maybe he'd accept like a Lou Williams type role where he does that coming off the bench, but, not all the players in the league can be a Lou Williams and not be in a rhythm. And, Fred even talked about how he had a hip pointer injury during the playoffs, and he kept telling Nick Nurse that he wouldn't be able to play if he got subbed out, and he said he kind of finessed his way in there. And, half of that's probably the injury, and half of that's probably him wanting to stay in a rhythm with how hot he was playing. So, maybe it's going to be interesting development to see Fred VanVleet, what role he has this season, what role he most thrives in. Because last season he had averages of 11 points and 5 assists throughout the course of the year, including all the games, and he had about around 30 starts. I don't know the specific number, but he was averaging 14 and 6 in those games he started. And Fred VanVleet, he's a guy that got minutes on a consistent basis. He was getting probably around 25, 30, 32 minutes, whether he was starting or not. But obviously the numbers increased when he was a starter. So, Fred, he might be a guy that's looking for that position. And, it's going to be interesting to see if he can, if he's looking to take that substantial leap. And, there's been, people are kind of all over the place on what they think Fred can be, whether, people think he should just be a backup point guard, or if he, could be a potential all-star at some point in his career. I know the comparisons to Jameer Nelson, who's a 2-time all-star, they've been thrown out there a lot. I think Fred VanVleet with the stroke, his, killer mentality, he can certainly do it if he's more consistent. And that's a big thing with Fred. We called him Steady Freddy in that 2017-2018 season, but last year there was a lot of ups and downs for Fred. We were talking about almost every pod that, Fred would be down maybe a couple games, not hitting shots consistently, and then, he'd bounce back for a couple, having a 20-point night, a 15-point night with 10 assists. So his game was kind of inconsistent, and maybe injuries had something to do with that last year. And, in the playoffs, it was the same thing. He had a phenomenal start to the postseason, going up against Orlando, that game 1. Then the rest of the first 2 rounds were pretty brutal for Fred. and then he had his kid in the conference finals, and Fred jokingly said that his kid got all the credit for winning for his turnaround, but then he was just an absolute monster, an absolute madman against the Bucks and against the Golden State Warriors. So I want to know what you guys think. Fred VanVleet, despite his inconsistencies, he's shown very high highs. What are your expectations for Fred in terms of his role with the Toronto Raptors this season? And what do you think of kind of production you're going to get out of him? So let me know in the comment section below. You're the best for making this far. Check out the Twitter, the Instagram, all that cool stuff. We're back on the roll with the Raptors Digest, so we really appreciate you guys sticking with it and checking us out. And let people know. We got a new system, new setup this season, so we're excited for the year. Anyways, I'm signing out. Cheers.